Hello, everybody, and welcome to Wine Grants, Season 2, unscripted chat about the unfunded, the official podcast of the Unfunded List. I'm Dave Moss, your host of the Moss Family Foundation and founder of the Unfunded List. With me this week is Amy Lazarus. Please say hello, Amy.
Hello. Thanks for having me, Dave.
Thank you for coming in here into this booth with me. It's really nice to have you. And we are drinking Sauvignon Blanc today, which is a popular choice on Wine Grants, and I couldn't be happier about that because one of my favorite kinds of wine.
Cheers.
We've already had a little bit of wine, but we will do our best to have a substantive discussion about grants. But first, I start every episode off by reading my guest's bio, and this episode is no exception, so let's begin. Amy Lazarus.
Either one.
Amy Lazarus is the founder and CEO of Inclusion Ventures, LLC, making welcoming and effective spaces the norm in workplaces and communities toward faster system change. Amy served as executive director at the International Institute for Sustained Dialogue for 5 years, first as the inaugural executive director for the Campus Network and then for the Institute. Amy also founded Pulse, a neuroscience-based leadership retreat to catalyze inclusive talent. Amy was a Coro Fellow in Public Affairs, earned an MS in Public Policy and Management at Carnegie Mellon's Heinz School, and founded Common Ground at Duke University. She is the outgoing curator for the World Economic Forum Global Shaper DC Hub, and is a recipient of USA Network's Characters Unite Award. Top 99 under 33 foreign policy leaders, facing History's Upstander Award, the American Express NGen Leadership Fellowship, and was the youngest person inducted into her high school's Alumni Hall of Fame. From Shaker Heights, Ohio, Amy now lives in Washington, D.C., serves on the boards of Coro National and Operation Understanding D.C. Amy practices Tai Chi and has sung backup for Aretha Franklin. Welcome to the booth, Amy.
Thanks, Dave.
We've had some impressive and varied bios read in the booth, and this is one of them. It's hard to know where to begin in here. Let's start with what you're doing now. Inclusion Ventures. You're making welcoming and effective spaces the norm in workplace and communities. How do you do that?
Yes, we work with organizations in every sector to create spaces where everyone can thrive and contribute and grow. So a lot of this is around how can you bring your authentic self to the workplace. So all of your identities, your race, your gender, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, your faith, your practices, your learning styles and preferences, and all of your different perspectives and worldview, and how can you do that, and how can I do that, and how can our other colleagues do that in a way that our identities don't get in the way of each other, but we can work through and together with those different perspectives to come up with better business priorities and goals. Mm-hmm. So it comes down to a lot of strategy, coaching, trainings, workshops, etc.
Now that seems particularly relevant to me, to the world of philanthropy, because generally, by definition, philanthropists aren't from the groups that they are supporting. And a point I've actually made several times on the podcast is that one of the most effective, efficient areas of philanthropy is towards the art. In particular, my grandmother used to be a big supporter of, she's from the Boston area, so she's a big supporter of art museums and the Boston Symphony Orchestra up there. And those are all wonderful programs. And here in D.C., same thing. We have great art museums. The Symphony and the Washington Ballet are wonderful programs and have a lot of support from philanthropists. Now, one of the reasons those programs are so effective at delivering high-quality art is because the philanthropists are also the recipients of the services. Mm-hmm. So if it were to be bad ballet or a poor art exhibit, or if it were to be inefficient in some way, the patrons, who are also the patrons, would find out about that and complain, and it would be fixed. And these things work very efficiently. Now, when you're funding a poverty program or a hospital or something that brings malaria nets to Nigeria or something of that sort, you're not the recipients of the services. You don't necessarily notice the problems. You also probably don't necessarily understand the perspectives of the people being served. And I think lots of sectors are waking up to the sort of work you're doing. I think probably there weren't a whole lot of inclusion consultants when you and I were born. I think I might have been born before you. But I think I think it's generally quite good. Would you agree that this is a growing field of study for professionals?
From when we were born about 40 years ago, I think it certainly has grown from that.
If you want to admit to being that age, you go right ahead.
I was fortunate to be born and raised in Shaker Heights, which is a community that's 50-50 black-white. So I've been doing this work kind of my whole life. The cool thing to do in high school was to try out to be in the Dialogue on Race Relations Club, which was high school students that taught 4th and 6th graders at a young age about how to be friends across difference. What's stereotype, what's prejudice, what's discrimination. And what I see is that a lot of what you and I would call adults still don't have that full understanding and also don't have the comfort to be able to talk across lines of difference. So a lot of my work is because people didn't grow up in a place where the norm is knowing how and why to talk across these lines of difference, and then that comes into their workplaces and their communities. And so I think more and more there's an acceptance of this being a job for people to teach and learn these skills. I think you also see in corporate America a lot of chief diversity officers really over the past 20 to 30 years, and a lot of those folks have now cycled out and are retired or are consulting. So there are certainly a lot of diversity and inclusion consultants, and fortunately and unfortunately, there's a lot of work to do. All you have to do is read the news and see that people really don't know how to talk across lines of difference, and that is resulting in a lot of challenges.
Well, I think diversity got initially marketed quite poorly, like a lot of things do, and I think that that's probably a very big generational difference.
Yeah.
A lot of supporters of a certain candidate for president may not fully understand what is meant, and from the business aspect, you should be pursuing this because you will do better at business.
Oh yeah.
I feel as though people think it's more of the sort of have the affirmative action in their head, and that sort of thought. And really, like, the more diverse your perspectives in the room, the better off it is.
So actually, in some ways, yes, and the research shows that if you're only recruiting for diversity, you actually won't achieve the results that you're looking for in terms of innovation and creativity. You actually have to have the well-managed diversity.
Right. Well, thanks for saying it before I did, because you're the expert.
You're welcome.
But I was going to segue into a very similar point, is that you can't it's not about filling a room with different perspectives and saying, well, now we have different perspectives. You need to, there's more work other than just on the recruitment side. Now, here in the Lookout, we make film. And this has happened a lot of times, and there's a lot of talk about, inclusion of different types of characters. And that's really tricky. It's not just about making sure we cast someone of every skin color, because there have been a number of projects where with very diverse casts, but if you're not if the people who wrote the script come from a certain background, the characters of other backgrounds aren't going to be relatable, right? And there've been a number of films where it's just like clearly the writers did not understand that person's perspective, and the same thing. So if I'm from the whitest state in the union, I'm from Maine. If I were to write, when I write things, the fact that very much colors what I write.
Pun intended.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So if I wrote something about my childhood, there wouldn't be any African American or Asian characters in it, because my childhood was 100% white.
Yeah.
And if I were to try to write something more inclusive, it would be bad, because I don't understand those perspectives. And I think that's fine. I don't think I shouldn't be allowed to write a story about my childhood, but we need it's just this requires, this is what I call 2-3-step thought, right? It's not just, well, all right, diversity is a thing now, we have to have different colors in the room, and then we're finished. It is, you have to, additional steps, and when you're doing those additional steps, I think a really good idea would be to hire Amy Lazarus over there at Inclusion Ventures, because she does a great job with this sort of work.
Thanks, Dave. If I can help put some terminology to those steps, because I think you raise really great points. Some of the work I'm doing with Stanford's Design School, and specifically Emily Calloway there, is around worldview. So exactly what you're saying. So what is your worldview? How did that come to be? How did growing up in Maine influence how you see the world and how you don't? And then when you're telling those stories or creating products and services, who may be missing from that perspective, and then how might that affect the user experience if you're not incorporating that. So some of it's the awareness and the diversity or lack thereof, and then there's inclusion. So even if you aren't the one to write about it, you can go seek other perspectives or talk with people who grew up differently than you. And then there's the equity piece, right? Look at who has access to getting their films and stories produced, who has access to being on stage. We see this in every sector of, there's a lot of whiteness happening.
Yeah. If all the executive producers stay white and Jewish,
right,
it doesn't necessarily matter. It's not so much about, and I think that the focus on the activism side is wrong on this front, because where are the characters of color? Well, the reason they're not showing up, and when they show up are not as deep, is because the people creating the content in the first place aren't from that community.
Right.
You can't write. It is, you got to write what you know.
And they're not taking that extra step of going out to hire people who don't look like they do and who have different perspectives and who have different experiences and worldviews to add to the richness of what they're creating.
Well, there's a African-American gentleman named Franklin Leonard, who is the script reader for one of the studios out in Hollywood. And he is, more than anybody, the influence for the Unfunded List. Every year, so he would read scripts, and then he suggests who you should make a movie out of. And every year he suggests a certain number of scripts, and some of them get made, some don't. And it was obviously quite frustrating after several years to have read really great scripts, suggest that they get made, see them not get made. Because, after him, it's business decisions. He basically says these are all good enough to make movies out of, and then they make various business decisions. And so he started the Blacklist, which is what they call it out there. It's a really cool website. And what he does is he has a lot of his friends, script readers and stuff. At the end of every year, they get to vote on the best script they read that wasn't made. And, then they publish a list. And they show all the scripts, how many votes it got, whatever. And I believe, so it's been around since 2005. And the film that got the most votes that first year was Charlie Wilson's War, which ended up eventually getting made and winning a number of awards and actually being a fairly meaningful and important and informative film for folks. What I find interesting about that is that was definitely a white person's film, but lots there. They now have I forget what it's called. There's a list specifically of films written by women, and some other efforts to be a lot more and inclusivity is definitely inherent in that process. And a lot of it is like, well, this script was judged well by the readers, but the guys who wrote it don't necessarily know the studio heads that well, or those sorts of issues, or political issues, and so I'm sitting there thinking, well, this is the same thing that happens to grant proposals, more or less.
Right.
And we have a little bit of a different setup. I would love to get more foundation program officers on the evaluation committee. We do have some, and we have some people who run foundations as well. And you are one of our more thoughtful members on the evaluation committee. I want to thank you.
Hear that, evaluation committee? Hear that?
Yeah, particularly those of you who still haven't sent me your feedback. I
Mine was a little late, though.
assume you're probably also not listening to the podcast. But if you could get that feedback in, that would be great.
No, it was a lot of fun to read that. If I can go back for a minute, I just want to
help her.
And they were all mostly brilliant. I want to bring home for your listeners, it's the one, why it's important to have inclusion in perspectives when we're talking about film, for example, because this isn't just about, let's feature women, let's feature people of color, right? What's happening from a neuroscience perspective is that our brains receive 11 million bits of information per minute, and we can only process 40 of them. 40 out of 11 million, which means that we're making a lot of decisions based on things that we're not even aware we're making decisions on. And a lot of that is what we're primed to make decisions on. A lot of that is what we've been exposed to over the years. A lot of it's through media. A lot of it's through movies and whatnot. And so when we sit passively and absorb and consume the same storyline, or the same, the white male is the hero, or a woman's job is to stay in the home and cook, which, is thinking about what we grew up with Saved by the Bell or whatever it is, those affect our behaviors and decisions in the real world. So, for example, there's some fascinating implicit bias studies that show for students that are taking an online class, half of them, they're divided into two sections. And within those sections, some receive teaching from a male and some from a female, and then same with the other section. But what's really happening is that the male professor is presenting as a male in one of the sections and as a female in another section. You following? So you can't actually hear their voice, but their avatar and their name and whatnot present. Students ranked the male professors much higher than the female professor. Same person. And when the computer sent the...
That is fascinating.
Right? It gets worse. The computer sent the scores back, delivered the papers with the grades at the exact same time. When asked to rank who delivered it faster, the students ranked males at like 4.5 out of 5 and females at 3.6 or something out of 5. So you think about, how is this possibly happening? And is this only because we're watching movies where women aren't strong leads right away? No. But does it add up? Yes. And so when we're talking about what are the images that are out there, who's portrayed, how is it that these smart college students can possibly think, no offense, that men are that much more amazing than women? They're not making this up. It's coming from somewhere deep down. And so that's part of why it's important to kind of democratize the images that we're exposed to.
That's very interesting. So both of my parents were college professors.
That's right. Did they rank your dad higher?
It's interesting you mentioned that. My father is the highest ranked professor in Colby College history.
That's right. By the way, I knew that both of your parents were a man and a woman, which is why I just assumed one. I just wanted to clarify that for our guests.
And in fact, you went to Duke undergrad, right?
I did.
Mom just finished up. She's not. She's retired there. That last year was her last year there. So this is at Colby. She was the one of the least popular professors. But that's like, there's a lot of things going on there. One, they're different people. And two, she teaches French, and he taught U.S. history, and he also taught sports history, Leisure in America class, which was like just a lot more fun. And the way he went about his class, they were more lecture style things where he was allowed to be more fun and free and do more, and just it was just a more interesting class. And history is fun. He also, I think, as you were talking, I was trying to think, well, what are some of the other reasons for that? Well, some of it's certainly because it's a male, because he's male and she's female. I also think some of it may be because this was in Central Maine where there weren't a whole lot of Jews, and she's a lot more obviously Jewish than I am. Some of that may have colored it. What I think is, as you were talking, this was the first time I had this thought. My father looks exactly like a history professor. He wears the corduroy jackets with the patches. He has the little spectacles on the end of his nose and a beard. Like, he looks like what you'd expect a history professor to look like, and so it fits more into what they were expecting to get from a professor.
And even that, how do we? Like, I have that image in my mind. From where does that originate? If I seen it in a film or in a TV show, who is casting that role? Why wasn't it, your mom, someone that looks like your mom, that looks like the stereotypical central casting history professor, right? Where does that come from?
Well, I think lots of times in like a lot of the high school dramas, the like mean teacher is cast as a woman. I don't know. I just think a lot of it, like, just for me, my French teachers I never liked that much. It's a much harder class. Yeah. I feel like learning a new language, and they tended to be more like, I don't know. I just have thoughts of being yelled at in French.
I wonder how.
I'm sure there's thousands of students out there who think about my mother that way.
Maybe. I wonder how.
Well, I've seen her teach class, and she is much less pleasant when she is teaching class than in her like normal course of affairs. Like that's so that like they're obviously, that's an anecdote and not necessarily a scientific study. But like those, and the other thing that's true. My father, the average grade in my father's class was one of the highest average grades at Colby, and my mother was consistently the worst, the hardest grader at Colby. Maybe another reason why.
Some things are starting to add up here.
Well, he was a very, very charismatic person. He has a popular radio show now in retirement.
Is it called the Unfunded List?
No, it's a golf related radio show called Tea Time.
Cute.
He has about 60,000 weekly listeners. He's a much better radio host than I am.
Listeners, please help us get to that number for this specific podcast. Please share widely.
I don't think any of the people listening to his... So he's on Monday night, and they just sort of talk about whatever golf tournament happened the week before. And he has some retired PGA players that come and join him. Nice. He lives in a big golf community down south. and golf's more popular than philanthropy is. And so he has a lot of listeners all over the world too. A lot of his listeners are from India, which perplexes him. But I'm like, they speak English there and they like golf.
There you go.
It shouldn't be that perplexing. But this podcast is about philanthropy. So talk to me a little bit about your work so you do, like you would work with a business or with a school or with anybody that needs work on this front. I think philanthropists need this sort, and particularly organized entities that do philanthropy work.
Sure.
Need to have this on their mind. And I know you do work with some groups, some philanthropists. Talk that how is this implemented at a foundation? How does the foundation when you get hired by a foundation? How do you go in there and do this?
Great. Let me give 2 examples. So I work with EPIP, Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy, and created their inaugural Inclusive Leadership Cohort. So we accepted 15 of their city leaders to, Dave, by the way, is filling his wine glass.
Our regular listeners are familiar.
Okay, with that sound. Yeah. So EPIP, we accepted their 15 chapter leaders to go through this inclusive leadership cohort. And part of what we looked at was if you're mid to low in your foundation and you are creating, you're giving grants to communities that you're not from or of, exactly what you were talking about earlier. How do you better serve communities that you're not from or of? How can you help decrease the power imbalance there? How can you leave your ego at the door and really listen and ask questions in a way that doesn't put people on the defensive? There's often such a power dynamic of, I know when I ran a nonprofit, trying to find the balance of wanting to be honest with the potential funders, but also wanting to tell them what I think they want to know, and that just didn't work, right? And so if you're on the
it's a very tough balance to strike.
And so how do you, as a funder, how do you put the potential grantee at ease and also get the information that you're looking for so that you can make the actual decisions? And also if you're mid to lower in your foundation and you're working at an organization that isn't quite as committed to social justice principles as you are, what is yours to do there? How can you lead from where you are? There's a lot of talk that I hear in philanthropy about wanting to recruit and retain different perspectives and people of color and people of lower socioeconomic status, and yet they're not always creating inclusive environments for those voices to be heard, and they're going to be losing out on folks.
I mean, I've been in some large foundation offices, and I can imagine if you were to hire someone from a low-income background and be like, hey, come in and just start working there, if you didn't also have like a plan for how they were, like they just wouldn't, that would be so, I mean, I go to some of these offices like the Bronfman Foundations, or I've been in I think the most ridiculous office I've ever, the Nathan Cummings Foundation in New York. I'm wealthy and I felt like I was I didn't belong there because of how nice everything was. It was like, it's like, well, I was there for a meeting and I'm like, this is a museum. Am I allowed to touch anything? Like what?
Probably not. Right. And so how do you create a culture that lets people be themselves and be their authentic selves, and recognizing that socioeconomic status is only one part of our many different intersecting identities, and yet it's an important part when you're talking about philanthropy. I work with Arabella Advisors, which is a B corporation that has a lot to do with philanthropy, and they're doing really wonderful, important, and hard work around both increasing the diversity of their workforce while also increasing the inclusiveness and equity of their workplace. And it takes top-down leadership and also bottom-up commitment and practice. We did trainings at all 4 of their offices across the country. We've done executive sessions and supervisory sessions, and they know that this is not just a one and done, let's have a training for half a day and wash our hands of this, check the box, we're diverse, inclusive, and equitable now. They know that this is a continued practice. And so I think part of what it takes in philanthropy is just like you would commit time to going over budgets or to going over your strategy. This is
strategic planning should be most of the time, right?
The Moss
you agree?
You
do agree
part.
that should be at least 99% of what you're doing, or 100% in our case. That's the only still the only thing.
101%.
As you may know, that one of the reasons I'm able to pull off this podcast is because I long ago. God, it's been 6 or 7 months now. The strategic planning committee has been in a locked room, and they haven't noticed.
Well, that was that closet down the hall.
Yeah.
Well,
they're in there and they're planning.
You joke.
It's great. They haven't paid attention to.
There's the really long bio that you read is a little out of date. One of the things that's not on there is that I recently joined the board of the Harwood Institute for Social Change, which is a wonderful nonprofit
Sounds prestigious.
in Bethesda. Yes, Rich Harwood.
Harwood.
It's a last name. But one of their main tenets, I guess I could say are, because I'm on the board, but one of the main tenets is about turning outwards. So in other words, is your point of reference the locked door conference room down the hall, or is your point of reference the community? And so many times, whether it's in philanthropy or in organizations where people are really smart and mean well, they're making decisions based on what's inside and from what you said earlier, from your personal perspective, instead of from someone that's outside that might want something else. And so how do you turn outwards? How do you listen? How do you ask the right questions? And how do you incorporate that even when you're hearing something that you wouldn't necessarily agree with or come up with? And that's really where the real change starts to happen.
And on that last bit, I think that's a big challenge.
Yeah.
A lot of people, I don't think anybody gets into philanthropy to feed their own ego. But I think it's like this sort of bonus that can, and it can be sort of consuming for folks, including some of my predecessors at the Moss Family Foundation. We have even the name Moss is on some plaques and stuff. I think I will never. There won't be any more plaques unless I do it like sardonically or something. Yeah.
Sardonically? I don't know. That might not happen.
But it was for a lot. Like I think lots of times you sort of, because you're a philanthropist, you give yourself permission to be more egotistical than you could normally get away with. If you watch a foundation's video about themselves, you'll see that. And like no one uses the word "I" more often than philanthropists. No one, not even U.S. senators. It's crazy. Because a lot of that's because they go through these long strategic planning processes that sort of where they focus on their own values, and they get convinced that those are relevant and important to other people.
Well, it's interesting.
I don't think anybody wants to hear anyone talk about their own. I mean, it's good to have a good sense of your own values. But if I went out on the street right now and started talking to people about my values, I don't think anybody wants to listen to me.
I'd rather know what I would want to know what drew you to those values and what are the behaviors that demonstrate those. I think whether it's foundations or any organization or any person, there's often a disconnect between intention and impact. And so the intention behind creating the values and getting clear on that so that you know what drives it is positive. The impact doesn't always quite match up or align with the reality of what's out there in the world that really needs to be addressed and how it can be addressed to make real change.
Interesting. So how did you enjoy your experience as a member of the inaugural evaluation team?
I really enjoyed it. You were talking about Unfunded now.
The Unfunded List.
The Unfunded List, excuse me.
That's fine.
I got to read.
Unfunded for short is fine.
It's so cool now we're shortening it.
Yeah.
I got to read 2 really wonderful grant proposals. I really appreciated learning more about the great stuff happening here. And one of them actually was about was City Dance, which I didn't know about and was really thrilled to learn. And right after I read it, it was over Thanksgiving time, I saw a close family friend who's in 6th grade and dances. And because I just read the report, I asked her, instead I would have normally asked, well, what's your favorite type of dance or something? But because of this, I was able to say, what do you learn from dancing? And she gave such a beautiful answer. And she said, I think, what do I learn or what do you like most about it? And she said, that time when you're practicing so much and you finally get it. And you could just see in her eyes the empowerment and the pride that comes from working hard to achieve something. And to see that comes from dance and then likely generalizes into other elements, other spaces to work hard, whether it's in academics or in relationships or whatnot. So I really enjoyed being able to take what I learned in my volunteer reading and apply it to a relationship with a family friend.
Interesting. What do you learn? What do you learn from dance? The more Jewish question would be, what do you ask about dance?
Why does one dance?
No, when I used to come home from school, my mother used to ask, what did you ask today?
I know, you started that
Did I tell you that?
well, we did it at Shabbat. We all went around and said, what is one thing you asked this week?
Oh, yeah, it's a Moss, you've been to a Moss Shabbat, yeah, you know about that.
You know, you've made it win. I really like that question, and I think we often ask, I actually do a whole module about asking the right questions. Because often we say, or we don't realize how biased we are in our questions. Well, don't you think X? Or, well, why not Y? Instead of an open-ended question, right? That can really make all the difference. I also get to work with the organization Ask Big Questions out of Hillel.
Yeah, Sheila Katz.
Yeah, Sheila and Josh Fiegelstein, and they're doing really great work on college campuses, getting students to learn how and why to ask big questions.
Yes, they were partners with the It's on Us campaign.
That's right. That's right.
Asking questions is it's a huge part of it. It's one of the if you grow up Jewish, it's the first official thing you do as a little Jew, because every year at the
4 questions. That's right.
I was the youngest person in the room, many times growing up in Maine, because I was usually the only child. Again, it's just all white Catholics, pretty much. So,
and you?
I was basically the blackest kid in my school because I was Jewish, and we didn't have any.
Dave, we're gonna have to have a little counseling session after this. I don't know.
I assure you, I was more black than the other kids, but not, definitely not all the way there. I had a lot more of an outsider perspective, and as a result, identify more with people on the margins, I think, than with people who look like. Here in D.C., I look very much like a white male, really indistinguishable from a white male. But I feel I think as a result of being from Maine, my perspective is a little bit different, and a lot, and I think I had not a tremendous amount of difficulty, but some difficulty with my first few years. In D.C. working with folks who, particularly folks who were not from Maine, because it never occurred to me, I don't think it occurred to them, that we were as different as we were. Because, well, he's an American, Maine's in America, he must be. But no, I really needed a lot of orientation that I didn't get when I came here. Because it's a long distance I came to come here, and it's entirely different. I mean, you should see where I'm from. It does not look like here at all. We don't have elevators, right? It's a lot more pickup trucks, and a lot more pine trees, and there's a lot more space between the buildings. And people have a different accent and have different expectations for the things like professionalism and dress and how you act and how late you stay up and all sorts of things are. All sorts of things are different, and I think America's a really big country, and we sort of we have a tendency to forget that, and so I was my first few I worked for nonprofits pretty much my entire time in D.C. so far, and I was usually serving communities drastically different than I lived in here and that I had grown up with, that the extremely educational experiences for me. I think perspective is one of the most important things, and one of the most underrated pursuits that we have in America. Everybody should be trying to have as much perspective as possible about things, and should be trying to be a lot more empathetic and understanding of other people's perspectives. And I think hardly anybody is doing that at all, or even gives that passing thought. When I worked at Atlas Corps, one of my favorite anecdotes when I was trying to convince people of the value of perspective was to tell them about one of my favorite Greek myths. Are you familiar with Tiresias, the character Tiresias?
I can't say that I am.
Do you know Oedipus? Mm-hmm. In Oedipus, he has a blind soothsayer. Mm-hmm. That's Tiresias.
All right.
Tiresias has his own backstory, separate from Oedipus. That's that's fascinating. What Tiresias did is he prayed to the goddess Athena, and prayed to be he wanted to be the wisest man in all of Greece. Athena, please make me the wisest man in all of Greece, he said. And Athena was like, all right, if that's what you want, I am a god, so I can make that happen. So the first thing she did for Tiresias is she teleports him to Assyria and leaves him there. And so he ends up and he has to live in Assyria as an Assyrian for 7 years. And then at the end of those 7 years, brings him back to Athens, but turns him into a woman. So he lives in Athens as a woman for 7 years. and at the end of that period, turns him back into a man, but makes him blind. And so he lives for 7 years, and he's sort of starting to wish he had never made this request. He doesn't really understand why she's been, in his view, tormenting him. And he finally says, why have you done this to me? Like, I thought you were going to make me the wisest man in Greece. And she says, you are the wisest man in Greece. Because there was no one in Greece who knew what it was like to be an Assyrian, who knew what it was like to be a woman, who knew what it was like to have seen and not have seen. He had tremendous perspective that, and all of that perspective, according to the myth, made it possible for him to see the future by listening to birds. That part's a little bit weird Greek augury stuff.
Yeah, you had me until the birds. But yeah, I really
they called
like
it
what you're
augury,
saying.
and that's how the priests used to predict the future. They would release birds and listen to the sounds they made as they were released. And they would release them near statues of gods and watch how that affected them. And it was a whole science. Augurers, they were called.
There aren't many of those these days.
There are some.
Yeah, not
They
as
actually
many
do.
in DC,
They do
I
exist.
guess. But you know what you're saying. I know we're running out of time here, but just to the point about perspectives is so critical. And you think about the day-to-day life that I go through, or that you go through, or that the listeners go through. What are the perspectives that are our norms, and what aren't our norms, and how can you also find ways to increase your perspectives in authentic ways that aren't like, oh, hey, tell me what it's like to be you, right? There's a way to do that authentically. We also don't want people who are different than we are to always be the educators. And so how do you find that balance and try on different perspectives and have empathy and put yourself outside of your comfort zone? And all of that could really make you a more effective leader when you're making decisions. I think Colin Powell used to ask for something between 17 to 23 different memos from different perspectives that he would read before making a decision. So when you're making decisions,
Between 17 and 23,
it's somewhere in that. It might have been, just depending on the decision.
Not 24 or 16,
I just
though.
want to be as
That's
accurate
ridiculous.
as I can with your listeners. But yeah, and those are from all different people with different perspectives that didn't grow up like he did, right? And so who is in your circle of influence that you can go ask before you're making a choice?
Awesome. Well, it has been a pleasure having you here in the booth.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure being here. Thanks for the invitation for this and to be part of the inaugural Unfunded List. And thanks for the work that you do.
Well, I hope you will stick around. We have all kinds of exciting stuff planned for 2016, and we will need plenty of talented evaluators.
Wonderful.
As always, I want to thank our host, the Lookout DC, which is a beautiful co-working community for filmmakers located in the Adams-Morgan neighborhood of Washington, D.C. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And everybody out there, good luck with your funding.